we now have some time for questions and answers. And
So I think, given all the things that Joel says, isn't this a good opportunity for IRBs and maybe governments as well to really, really be a lot less anal about what goes on in their informed consent?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and it's been something I'm thinking about. And I think there's also some discussions about that. And I would say that yes, I would agree with you. Perhaps it's time to look at our consent form templates and see what is required. But I also do know or understand there's this requirement from the law as well that there are certain things that have to be met. So I think you have to balance it as well. But I think research has shown that participants are just not being well informed, and I think that is a sign that we need to do something about it.
Can I just say something on this? So, I mean, the future of large language models is not just using the sort of ChatGPT that you can access, it's actually developing trained models. So, Joel's concerned that, if you use a large language model, it might deviate from the template of your IRB. An IRB can train a large language model on all of its templates and all of its data, including model consent forms. Either a DSRB or some form of IRB could make available a trained version of a large language model to researchers that they plug in their raw consent form, and then it comes back with a specific one for that IRB or for Singapore. And Joel's kind of concerns about hallucinations, the fact that it said very sick instead of unwell, as he says, whatever comes out of the LLM in terms of a consent form will have to be checked by the researchers. And I don't think that's a hallucination. I would just cross out very sick and make it sick, or change it back to unwell. It's not very difficult. So I think the future is going to be for IRBs developing their own trained versions, or maybe there's a single one for Singapore that places the constraints that you want. Because as I mentioned, NIAM is training they have a secure version of ChatGPT, so the data doesn't go outside. So they've created a local model. So that's how they're using all patient data. So there's none of these sorts of risks that ChatGPT will be using it. And they're training it on specific guidelines for the treatment of breast cancer, specific research articles. And the same could apply in research. So I can't. It seems a no-brainer that you're going to be using them to improve consent forms, as he says.
Hi, I have a question about something related to trust and public acceptance of those AI-based tools. Like in the first speaker, you said something that you can generate different models, interpretive model or maybe informative model. So how do you make sure that, because I understand those models are developed based on certain kind of evidence from certain clinical trials or other channels. So how do you make sure that those are best evidence that is based on that you get some kind of interpretive model? And how to make sure that public can accept based on those models in terms of trust and that kind of.
Yeah, so I think, when I trust somebody to turn up at night, I got messages from Sumi saying, "Are you coming to the talk?" So he obviously doesn't trust me. But trust is built on reliability. That you've had an experience with somebody, and when they say they do something, that they do it. So trust is built on our past experience and how predictable future behaviour is. So whether patients will trust this will depend on how they use it and their experiences and satisfaction with it. So I think it is important to do empirical research to see whether trust does develop. But in my view, the only way you can achieve that is by developing reliable AI that meets the patient's values, and as Joel correctly said at the end, that they use it and they find that it actually does, what it's supposed to do, And in the case of, accessing evidence, it's really going to be a matter of testing whether it actually accesses the right body of evidence, communicates it in the right way, interprets the patient's values in the right way. So I think it's not possible in advance of using and testing this kind of AI to make definitive predictions. I think it's really an experiment. We're part of this massive experiment, and I think we either get on the train or we get left behind at the station. And I think in research and IRBs, as Joel correctly says, I think it's time to sort of get on the train and to start to make experiments and evaluation. I agree with him. It's not necessarily a silver bullet. We have to test it, but until we test it, we won't really know.
On the question of using ChatGPT to administer consent. Now, one of the reasons where consent has to be done very properly is the follow-up possible legal suits. You might know about 3 years ago, there was this case where a surgeon was fined $100,000 because when he was doing an injection for tenosynovitis, the patient felt severe pain, and the patient said there was no indications of that in the consent form. So I'm very curious whether, I think it's, as you said, it's a huge experiment. Consent being administered by ChatGPT compared with consent being administered by a human being, in the long run, what will be the legal implications? Will there be more or less legal cases should anything go wrong? I tell you why I'm saying this. One of my background, I'm a clinical physician for more than 40 years, but I'm also a principal mediator of the Singapore Mediation Center, a court mediator, and I mediate medical cases. In addition, I'm an education panel of the Medical Protection Society, which is the main provider for malpractice insurance for doctors in the private sector. So one of the aspects I learned from all this is the human element is very important in reducing legal suits. I'm fully for the idea of ChatGPT administering consent, but I'm just curious if you do intend to do that study compared with human, to do a long-term follow-up, not just the satisfaction of the patient, but whether in the long run will it reduce or increase legal suits should anything go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, part of this great experiment is that it requires very long-term follow-up and regular surveillance, and we don't even know whether driverless cars will be safer when they're actually used. So it would be crazy to just introduce this, even on some evidence that reduces, legal suits, without following up in the long term, because I don't know whether it will increase or reduce. So I think and the same applies to the use in research. It's a matter of humans evaluating the performance. Sometimes you hear this discussion, what we need is more explainable AI, and without explainable AI, we can't trust it. Explainability is just instrumentally valuable to prediction. If you understand how something works, you can be confident what it will do in the future. But what really matters is what it does and whether that's justifiable. So what really matters is not explainability, it's justifiability. And with black box AI, you can only get justifiability by regular evaluation of performance by human beings and saying, does this meet our goals? Is this doing what we value? Is it good or bad? And so I agree with you, this is a very long-term prospect that we can't answer definitively in advance of using it. But if I were a clinician contemplating this, what I would do is I would use ChatGPT replacing a junior doctor, and I would check the transcript. I would look at the transcript of the interaction and eyeball it quickly and say, has it covered everything that should be covered? And then I would ask the patient, do you have any other questions? That's a huge advantage over trying to work out what the junior doctor has said, because you can see the transcript there. Now, if you've got both a written consent form or some sort of audio-visual around the core information and a transcript of the interaction, it seems to me, and you check that, you're in a pretty strong position. Because if you've said, does anything else matter to you? And the patient, hasn't said, I don't like painful procedures, or, I'm very worried about how much pain this will cause, I think the chance of that sort of action is much lower. Presumably, in that interaction, what happened was the doctor didn't inquire about how important pain or discomfort or was to the patient, or didn't transfer information in relationship to that. I don't know the case. But it seems to me that it would reduce the chances of that if it was done properly. The problem is with this material risk criterion is we don't know what matters to people. And we only have, apart from asking an open-ended question like that, but large language models can be programmed to interrogate that in greater detail because they have time. That's the whole point. They have, a large body of text or a large body of information around what the whole range of potential, implications could be. So it seems to me that there's at least the prospect of them doing better.
Joel, do you have anything on the legal aspect?
No.
Other questions from the audience?
It's not really a question, but more of a feedback or a comment. So I'm thinking on the terms of, because I'm coming from a sponsor perspective, and if you're thinking about this is technically an investigator type of responsibility. However, in the sponsored clinical trials, the investigator actually depends on the sponsor to build such systems. So in this case, then if there's a legal aspect to it, who is then legally liable? Is it the sponsor that creates the system that uses the chat GPT, or is it this investigator who is supposed to perform the consent in the end of it?
I'm not a legal expert, so I'm just giving, from an ethical perspective, what matters in this sort of new wild west of AI is that we actually make it clear, in part it's who we choose to make responsible. And in my view, it should be the doctor or the principal investigator. So I mentioned the case of using it in medical procedures. I think it should be, the surgeon should be checking what's happened in the transcript and whether they're happy, with that procedure. So, the buck has to stop with somebody. Now, if somebody sells a product that doesn't function properly, so if an IRB, produces a large language model for facilitating better consent forms and it has a defect in it, and it creates consent form, a consent that's invalid. Arguably, there's the possibility of the action falling back to who's produced the large language model. But as I've said, it really, research, the principal investigator or whoever's in charge should be checking the product. So, I think the liability will fall. It should fall with the doctor.
Joel, do you want to clarify the liability?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about it. I think whatever you mentioned, I think it's something that we have to see in time to come in case law. I think, for example, like driverless vehicles like Tesla, I think right now in the US, they're trying to figure out, who's involved, who's going to be the one that's responsible. Is it the one behind the driver's seat? I think there was this case of a Meta employee playing with his handphone, and then Tesla is trying to say, it's the driver that's at fault, but then, family saying, it's actually Tesla or perhaps the AI developer that's at fault. And I very much agree with what Julian is saying. If you recall, I mentioned at the end where I say that it's going to be, you still require a human in the loop. And whatever Julian is suggesting, if I'm interpreting correctly, is you're not getting consent GPT to have full control over the process. You're just using it as a co-pilot. At the end of the day, can you really ascribe responsibility to the AI? To me personally, in an ethical sense, at this moment, I don't think so. You still ascribe responsibility to the doctor or to the investigator. So I think, if let's say you do have consent GPT, at the end of the day, it's still the responsibility of the doctor to check through, the transcript was whatever that's required to be covered, as a participant understand whatever has been said.
Yeah, so just to clarify, yeah, so the emergence of AI and use of ChatGPT does not affect current liability and legal provisions. So Human Biomedical Research Act, the researcher has the legal responsibility to ensure adequate informed consent. That's whether they're using ChatGPT or not. So if they use ChatGPT to generate a consent form that is flawed, the researcher is legally liable for any flaws. And research institution also bears liability under the Human Biomedical Research Act to ensure that there are systems in place to provide adequate consent. Sponsor, I think currently the sponsor isn't directly responsible for the consent process, but whatever the current indirect responsibility for product provision.
Yeah, I think for sponsors, like what I mentioned, you can use LLMs for your templates. I think IRBs would be quite familiar with it that, your templates are like 10 to 12 pages, but unfortunately your sponsor templates are way much longer, so you can use that. But yeah, in terms of the consent process, it'll pretty much fall on the investigator.
And the research institution.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there was another question back here.
I would just like to follow up some questions by this gentleman here about long-term applicability. We know that this consent GTP or chat GTP is mainly data-driven. And in future, in long term, we see much more data will be dumped. Some of them will be reliable, some of them will be unreliable data. And we also know, since we are very early and we see that this is a dynamic field, so things may change in future. As for all other technology, we also foresee that this technology may be upgraded or become different in longer term. So how you see, in your opinion, what is today and going to be tomorrow?
Well, I think as Joel said, with this, whatever is model drift, that, we have to continue to ask the question, is this answer right? Is this performing well? That's what for a human to retain their dignity and humanity and not be a slave to the machine is required. So, no matter how long the progression, it's still, we still need to ask, now we don't ask our calculator every time it produces an answer, is that correct? We know that it's reliable, but this is not a calculator. So they're always, and that I think is the biggest challenge, not just in medicine, but in using this artificial intelligence to retain a first personal stance of evaluation of, does this make sense? Do I think this is doing the right? Do I need to do more investigation? Do I need to do more research? So, it can go wrong at any point. Even if it's working well, that's the difference between drugs and devices. You do a randomized controlled trial on a drug, and you know pretty well what its effects are, although you need to do post-market surveillance and there can be rarer side effects for specific groups. But, for the group, you know that aspirin is going to have these effects on risk of stroke in this sort of category of patients. AI is not like that. As you correctly say, it's just constantly evolving. Now, it may not be getting better. So it is a real challenge. And I don't know what the simple answer to that is, but I think the first thing to realise is that it won't be once and for all, or it won't be like drugs and devices.
Thanks. Other questions from the audience? If not, I might query something Joel raised, but also that Julian also mentioned, which is about this issue of transparency and whether, and I'll first direct this towards Joel. You mentioned this is one of the three areas of concern, but I guess I'm trying to figure out why is it, when we're talking about drafting a consent form, why does transparency matter? Okay, so we have a consent form, it's really wordy, and we want to improve it. We run it through ChatGPT or another LLM, and now it looks really good, and we do a check. Why does it matter how the LLM came to its recommendation? I do my check. If it looks readable, if the information is accurate, I can correct the inaccuracies. Why does it matter that I understand exactly why it changed the wording from one word to another or whatever?
Okay, yeah, I think so. When I mentioned transparency, there's that different definition. So that's one aspect which I quite agree with you. At certain points, it's not necessary, but I'm thinking here in the process of consent form where you are presenting this set of information to your participants, right? So you want to make sure that's factual. And so, like I mentioned, often at times the words used inside can be quite scientific or technical. So you're using that LLM extension of yourself to help demystify some words. And if it's going to demystify, so for example, if you are a medical professional and you know the word syncope in a layman term, it's fainting, you would immediately know that that's correct. But if, let's say, you are a research assistant who happens to be trained in psychology, for example, you do not know what it means, it can't tell you where it's coming from. But I guess that's slightly a side issue, because at the end of the day, you know, whatever that you're going to put in the consent form, you still have to check it. You need to ensure that whatever is in there is true. So let's say you decide to use Wikipedia to help you do that layman kind of translation. You need to know where's your sources coming from. You're using from Wikipedia. Is that even correct? Should that be even the place you're using from? So I'm guessing what they're trying to say is it can't really tell you where it's taking from, so you shouldn't be using it as a source of gospel truth in that sense.
But I mean, I can't see what, it just seems to overwhelmingly strong case to use LLMs to make consent forms better. I mean, the one that you showed me, I haven't worked in this area for 25 years or 30 years, but that was a terrible consent form. Like you said, syncope, convulsive, it's like, I don't know how that was ever passed by an IRB. But if you use an LLM, you've just got to, somebody has to look at the result and say, is this correct? Is it better? And I wouldn't know what actually the level of a 15-year-old is in terms of language, or level of 12-year-old. So the IRB can say, we want consent forms at the level of a 15-year-old. Plug that into ChatGPT, it comes out, all you have to do is check it. All I would have changed was that, very sick to just sick, or maybe change it back to unwell, but otherwise it was much better. It was clearly much better. So I can't see what the downside is to using large language models, because you have to check them to make sure they've covered all of the risks and they've conveyed them in the right way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's a question of what we're really gaining by that. I mean, there's two potential benefits: is the time savings that there is just improving the language. Of course, if you have to do the prompt engineering to go back and forth, it's not clear you're going to save time versus a human rewrite. But you might indeed do much better than human. So, I sit on one of the DSRB domains, and I'm admittedly not that great about writing in layperson's language, right? So this is like a skill that ChatGPT might have that I wouldn't. But then there's a question of, is this actually more appropriate for a tool for researchers to use? So researchers use this when they're writing consent forms. Or is this actually a tool that IRBs should be using when they get the consent form and it's jargony, and someone would say, oh, go back to the researcher, please rewrite this, and they go back, and sometimes it's okay, we got to send it back again. Or should the IRB say, no, we'll just do a rewrite, we'll run through these things that we find too jargony and propose it to the researchers to check. And then the researcher, because me as a layperson actually won't know the synonyms of these terms, but we send to the researcher, okay, we did a little rewrite. So which of these two pathways, Joel, do you think is more appropriate?
Well, your IRB may do that for you if they are willing to do, but then I'm coming from the IRB perspective, and honestly, the IRB is only there as a gatekeeper at the end of the day. It's just like okay, so Julian has an MD, right? So it's like, Julian, you're my doctor, and you are giving me advices, and then I eat unhealthy food, and I tell Julian, why are you not stopping me from eating my unhealthy food? You should have stopped me from eating that fried chicken. It's the same thing. It's the same analogy. Your IRB is there being helpful. They are the gatekeeper, but at the end of the day, it's researchers, it's your responsibility, it's your obligation. So, to me, I have this view that, research is not a right, it's not an entitlement, it's actually a privilege, and you want to gain this rapport with your participants. And so, you should do whatever you can, and I would say that it's also going to be, in the long run, beneficial for you and your other fellow researchers, because the IRB is just not looking at your application. They've got a myriad of applications to look at.
Yeah, I got a different view. I don't think research is a right or a privilege. It's an obligation. I mean, research is literally life-saving. So it's not that, we ought to be doing research. IRBs ought to be quickly approving this because there's an opportunity cost if they don't. So unless they've got a good reason for holding something up, then it's unethical. So, I think if, there's a reason that Singaporean government, or it could be centrally funded to facilitate a public good. So I think we should be much more aggressive about facilitating research, and this is one way to facilitate research. And if you centralise it, then you can make it more cost efficient. You only need one trained LLM. You don't need every researcher trying to use untrained ChatGPT and making a mess of it. So I think that this is an area where Singapore could be a leader.
So that might be actually the next step. It's interesting. We talked mostly today about kind of the theory and the ethics, the backdrop of this. But of course, the natural next step is to create a tool, right? So let's talk in theory about using ChatGPT, but to create an actual program that researchers can access and run their. I mean, that might be trained on your template. That might be in a secure environment. So there's confidentiality protections, right? But asking researchers to just go off into the ether and do it on themselves, that might be difficult. But so if there is anyone involved in IRB work that is interested in developing such a tool, I think there would be great value. Another model that you didn't mention, but I have seen, another tool that I've seen proposed and trialed is, okay, you talk about the human drafts the consent form and the LLM edits it. But actually, you could have the LLM draft the consent form from the beginning. You can provide some bullets. You can provide a research protocol, and then you can provide a consent template. Right? And you can have LLM. There are some models that have been produced to do just this, and they say, okay, please generate a readable consent form at this grade level, and then you would check the output, and the LLM can generate the consent form, and the human checks that for accuracy and comprehensibility and so forth, and then that's even more potential time savings for the researcher.
I think that's very promising, and I think that's the way things will go. But I also think what eventually we'll have is a human avatar that you get to converse with, that's powered by LLM, that you can ask whatever you want for as long as you want in the way that you want, and I think that you will see these as doctors providing consultations, but research avatars discussing the research. So I think that things will change radically.
On the aspect of hallucination, has anything been done to ask ask the LMM when it generates a hallucination of evidence? For example, those mysterious or non-existent cases, legal cases, where it got its evidence from. So, I mean, it's related also to the issue of transparency. Does the LLM itself know how it does it? And is there not a way, to objectively then ask it to say, okay, you've been searching the web for XYZ resources, right? Presumably, much better than us, right? So when you came to this conclusion that this case existed, exactly what were your references, what were your sources and all that? Has anything been done about that?
Well, they can provide reasons. So I think the critical thing again, so we're also doing this, we've also got this project called the Personalised Patient Preference Predictor, where you train an LLM on a person's own material. So in my case, it was trained on 73 papers, but it could be trained on your blogs or your writings or your tweets or your patient record, any information about you. So it becomes a personalised version of ChatGPT. And then when you're unconscious, you're incompetent, doctors can ask your personalised LM, would he want to be kept alive in this situation or would he want treatment terminated? And when you ask families, they're only 50% accurate at predicting what the patient would want. So we have this concept, but we want to test it and see if it's more accurate than the family. But what matters is not just the accuracy, it's actually the reasons. So you can then go in and say to the personalised model, why do you think he wouldn't want treatment? What are your reasons? And, we can refine, January the 7th, 1996, he wrote this thing, and on the basis of that, I'm saying this. So I think you're completely correct. Interrogation of the reasoning of LLMs is something that will go forwards. The other thing which I mentioned just briefly is, and I haven't. I'm a complete imbecile at using these, but I've got very smart people, young people who do use them. One of the things I think is competition between LLMs, or not competition, but synergy between them. So you can ask Claude, what do you think about the veracity of the cases, or what do you think about the cases that this model has come up with now? Now you have, and they work in different ways. So you can actually use the strengths of one to identify the deficiencies of another. So I think that's also going to be something that's quite interesting of using different LLMs to interact with each other.
Yeah, I think on your point on hallucination, a lot of research is going into it right now. I think Oxford just released a paper recently about, I think they've managed to find out when's likely for a chance for LLM to hallucinate. So I think there's a lot of progress, but also in part because of how ChatGPT functions. Actually, it's essentially a stochastic parrot, as one researcher put it. You can think about it as a really good auto-completer. You know, on your iPhones, right, you type something and then it suggests the next word. So essentially, it's really good at that. It suggests based on certain statistics. So in that sense, it can't really tell you where the text is coming from. I mean, you've got things like Copilot, which presumably is able to provide you with references or source of where they could find it from. And then, you know, if you check that text with Google, perhaps you can see that there is this lineup of the text. Perhaps they actually did a copy and paste. But other than that, at the end of the day, like I mentioned, you need to have a human expert to interrogate the outcomes. So, for example, like I just recently started studying philosophy. My background is not in philosophy, it's in biology. So there are many concepts that I don't know, and sometimes, you know, I just play around the LLM thinking it's quite good, and I put in certain things. And then it tells me something, and I think it seems quite believable, but upon further interrogation, I say, no, that isn't true. And I tell the LLM, no, that's not true. And then it says, oh, you're right, that's not true. So at first it says it's A, and I say, no, it's B. And then later on, I tell you, no, it's not B, it's A. And then it tells you, oh yeah, you're right again. So you can see how, you know, the LM is not so smart in that sense. You still need to be you still need to have a human expert to interrogate it. Yeah.
Thanks so much. So on that note, please thank our speakers again.